But leave that story for later. We haven't quite come to Stalin's century yet. Spartacus rises up and dies. So does Robespierre. Who exemplifies legitimate defense of class? It depends on whom you ask, of course. To Trotsky, for example, Robespierre must be called a magnificent bourgeois forerunner of communist revolution. To Carlyle, he's a wicked sea-green mediocrity, the 18th century manifestation of Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. But risings up occur no matter what you think of them. Likewise, risings down. After all, says Stalin to H.G. Wells, who's come back from war, the rich experience of history teaches that up to now, not a single class has voluntarily made way for another class. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today we're talking about Volume 2 of William T. Vollmann's lifetime achievement, his crowning jewel in his repertoire, even though his repertoire is not closed yet, the magnum opus of the Vollmann canon, Rising Up and Rising Down. I finally have the McSweeney's unabridged 7-volume set, and moving into Volume 2, we are now moving into the phase of Rising Up and Rising Down, where he begins to present his justifications. Or not his justifications, but the justifications for violence that across history, across recorded history from the ancient Greeks up to around the very first little bit of the 21st century. This was published in 2003. And the justifications in this volume that are covered: defense of honor, defense of class, defense of authority, defense of race and culture, and defense of creed. Now, he will go on in volumes 3 and 4. Volume 3, he'll continue with justifications: defense of war aims, defense of homeland, defense of ground, defense of the earth, defense of animals, defense of gender. So there's some really, hot button issues going on. He's going to talk about the ecosystem and about animals and, defense of animals and animal cruelty and defense of gender equality. But also then defense against traitors, defense of revolution. And then in Volume 4, he'll continue with deterrence, retribution, and revenge, punishment, loyalty, compulsion, and fear, sadism and expediency, sadism, masochism, and pleasure, moral yellowness and inevitability. And then we move into the evaluations part of this 4,000-page long essay. Essentially what Vollmann is doing is, now that the first volume has given us sort of the definitions of different things that are salient to his overall aims and goals, now he's moving into justification. So what he wants to do is, for these different categories, he wants to take case studies across history, and especially looking at revolutionaries from Pol Pot to Trotsky to Stalin to Robespierre to Joan of Arc to Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and even John Brown and John Wilkes Booth. He wants to present these cases for times in which people claimed that they were justified in violent acts. So ultimately, this is all playing into his moral calculus, which is the final result of this whole undertaking. He wants to present this moral calculus, and does present a moral calculus. The moral calculus is in the unabridged version. It's in its own volume in the unabridged version. I think I answered someone earlier and said that it is in the abridged version, but it's like sprinkled throughout. That's not quite true, because it is actually in there in one piece as well as sprinkled throughout. For that abridgment, he is taking over 3,200 pages of main text, and he's condensed it down to about 700 pages. Now, one thing that he leaves out in this second volume that really pains me is the section on defense of race and culture, which of course right now is extremely relevant and extremely hot. And it's amazing what he says and puts on display, and then derives as the moral calculus for when violent defense of race and culture is and is not justified. This is required reading for everyone right now. And it's so unfortunate that it's not in the abridged version. So let's just really hope that some noble soul out there brings this unabridged version to light, or at least a Kindle version or something. The way that he sets up each of these sections, honor, class, authority, race and culture, and creed, is he starts by presenting case studies from history to get us to think about these justifications that have been used, both for and against violence in each particular categorical context. Then he draws a list of principles, which is basically the moral calculus. And then he presents what he's calling this continuum of defense. And these continuums, or continua, at the end of each section, they're comprised of quotations from figures throughout history that Vollmann has culled during his research. And they are a real treat. I mean, this structure that he has come up with to present this is perfect for conveying the wealth of this research to the reader. You know, when I first thought about reading 7 volumes of nonfiction specifically about when violence is and is not justified, while very interesting, I really wondered if it could hold my interest. Already I knew from the abridged version that Vollmann, brings his style, his sort of wry, sardonic wit, and sometimes gallows humor to the stage to keep us engaged. But also, he's very intelligent and can think from so many different angles. And so even stuff that is clear cut and we almost want to tune out because, for example, we know Hitler is awful. We know that Stalin is just an abomination, right? We know the KKK is a blight on American culture. But he brings in, nonetheless, all these arguments that really cause us to stop and think just a little bit deeper, just going beyond that emotional knee-jerk response level and really trying to push through the immediacy of everything that's going on and all the different fulminations and press through to really get at that root, that taproot of, say, hate, which is at the bottom of a lot of the stuff that comes in with race and culture. Again, you can see the fruits of his research that also made their way into such novels as Fathers and Crows and The Ice Shirts and even Argall, Europe Central. So we start off with the opening chapter of the second volume, which is titled In the Judge's Chair. And so he's telling us what our role now is as readers. He says, please now imagine yourself in the judge's seat. Each of the remaining chapters in this first half of Rising Up and Rising Down offers up a defense, an invocation, a plea to be let off, held harmless, considered innocent. And so now we're to judge whether or not the defense offered across history is or is not justified. That is, we take an active role, not just active readers, but our ethics and our morals have to be engaged here. And he will help grind them and sharpen some things and dull some others, and really challenge us. Because to be honest with you, now that I'm reading this, it's funny, it really stands out to me when you're in conversation, you hear someone say, I've been thinking a lot about this, and then they insert their opinion on whatever the topic is. And Vollmann really challenges that sentiment of, have we really been thinking a lot about something we're about to offer our opinion on? Because if you dig through these tomes, it will give you a new sort of benchmark for the relativity of saying something like, I've given that a lot of thought or consideration. And another benefit we get from reading this is for us to condition and improve that component within us that really does need to give certain things real consideration. Of course, he talks often about how, in the end, he's a novelist. He works with words, and that comes out in certain. He can just make such chilling statements that really give emotion and power to what he's talking about. So in 1996, President Bill Clinton upraised the receiver of a telephone, spoke into it, and turned perhaps to his wife or to the concerns of his re-election campaign, while at his command, missiles came shooting down upon Iraq. So in case that isn't quite enough, he presses on. The next day, the military told him that there were still some targets left. He ordered another strike, just as any American might order a pepperoni pizza. I had to read that to my wife, and a chill went down her spine. Honor, in this context, will therefore be defined as the extent to which the self approaches its own standard of replying to or initiating violence. And a lot of what we talk about here is inner and outer honor. As he defines it, there's this outer honor that other people can see and this inner honor, which could also be linked to integrity. Gun control comes up. Of course, William T. Vollmann is a huge gun freak, gun nut. He puts these little cases, theoretical situations on display, and then he says something like, the police advised me to do nothing except to telephone. I think, if I have no weapon, I have no means of persuasion against the intruder. If I have a weapon, I'll either lose or be killed, or win and be jailed. I am not what I ought to be. And in those statements that he is able to take all of this different thought and all these different arguments and then give one statement like that. If I have a weapon, I'll either lose and be killed or win and be jailed. That's the tough situation that we're really in here. Again, with stuff that is extremely relevant today, he talks about monuments as these embodiments of honor. He talks about the Arc de Triomphe, and how Napoleon gave instructions to architects during building it. And he included this: generally speaking, no opportunity should be missed to humiliate the Russians and the English. And it's just amazing to think that that was the sentiment that went into establishing that monument. And what does it mean to us today? What does it mean to a Russian to look at that, to a Brit to look at that? One thing that I thought was really cool in here is that he uses as one of his source texts a book called Journey to the Ants, which is a joint enterprise with someone whose last name I always forget, but it's like Holden Globen, something like that, some sort of Dutch name. And then, but the name that I do always remember is E.O. Wilson, who is, of course, the leading formicologist, or is it entomologist? Shoot, now I can't remember. Anyway, one who studies ants. Myrmecologist, there it is. And I was thinking of the French word for ants, formier. And yeah, so E.O. Wilson is the still the leading myrmecologist, and he uses Journey to the Ants to contrast the way that ants work in their society and civilization, and where's there's this actual chemical connection and give and take between the queen ant and the workers, where they're mutually dependent upon each other. And this is certainly not how it is in American culture. Ants who sacrifice their lives to give food to the workers and things like this. And this really, really goes a long way. At first, I was dubious about whether he could really extend this metaphor, but I don't know what I was thinking. Vollmann succeeds and really puts into stark contrast the way that human nature works. And he closes one section by saying, "We may not want to be ants, but this has to be said. Unlike Lenin, unlike Stalin, ant queens are not known to kill vast numbers of their own nestmates." I love his little tongue-in-cheek and self-reflexive quips here, where he says something like, "To almost anyone sufficiently sedentary to read or write this book," meaning Rising Up and Rising Down, "the freedom and the hardship of nomadic life will be equally unimaginable." And what he's getting at is he's talking about Inuit nomads and trying to weigh their class hierarchy, to see if it gives us any insight into an ideal. In one of his great Gibbonesque type prose flourishes, he says, "My neighbor's field is better than mine. He follows Lord Millet, respects the sacredness of of borderlines. Therefore, he feels under no obligation to share with me. The stage is set. History's curtain rises. Weather, war, debt, disease, science, anti-Semitism, nepotism, lucky or expedient marriages, primogeniture, primogeniture, or even inheritance generally, which Bakunin saw as the principal perpetrator of inequality. Career specialization, topography, stupidity, arbitrary force, and individual ability now interrelate to make some accumulators more successful than others. A few of us can be druids, some will be knights, the rest will be commoners." And he's getting at the old class divisions among the Gauls around the 1st century BC. All throughout each section, he's desperately trying to get a definition for what honor is, what authority is, what is class. He says, what is class, we ask again? Is it rank or wealth or caste or status? The local definition matters not. Class is, quite simply, the particular arrangement by which power and resources get unequally distributed within a society, no matter whether its divisions are attenuated over long gradations, as in the many-tiered hierarchies of ancient China, or sharply marked as in Greece, where the democracy enjoyed by the citizen classes defined exactly and was exactly defined by the slave class with its paucity of civil rights. At one point, again, hearkening back to his comparison with ants, he says, "Must it be revolution then? Must we destroy the ruling class instead of bringing it into some lovingly conscious ant feedback system?" Just as he will give a checklist for potential revolutionaries, because this is something that he thinks about a lot. And in William T. Vollmann's final analysis and assessment, revolutions are extremely, extremely dangerous. And, they typically, historically, cause more bad than they do good, typically. And just as he'll give a checklist for revolutionaries, he also gives checklists throughout, such as evaluating any given government's legitimacy. Number 1, are the officials assistants of the people, or do they constitute a ruling class? Number 2, does the government perform its duties by love or by force? Number 3, does it enrich its citizens or make them poorer? Number 4, does it enhance liberties or restrict them? Number 5, does it treat the governed equally? Number 6, do people feel safer under the government or more threatened? And finally, number 7, does the regime's prescriptive definition of justice match the working definitions of its citizens or clash with them? Yikes. One of the greatest chapters in here pits Trotsky and his leadership in the Russian Civil War against Abraham Lincoln and his leadership during our own Civil War. And this is one of the most instructive sections I've ever read in any history book that I've read, which admittedly it's not a lot, but still it's enough to really stand out to me. This section, again, on race and culture brought me to tears in a couple of places, to be quite honest, and that never happens. Of course, it's because of the horrible history of racism in our country, and of course, recent and continuing events that are happening. What's incredible is that, again, this book was published in 2003. He brings out the case studies of riots and police brutality and all kinds of hot button issues that are extremely magnified right now. He gives us the history of John Brown and a lot of things from John Brown's letters and reactions against John Brown from all the different communities and audiences, which really puts our present circumstances into perspective. And it'll just make you feel over and over like, man, we just can't win this thing. And by we, I mean the people united to end racism. It's like that game at the carnival where you bop the gopher in the head and then the gopher another one pops out of another hole. It's endless. It's like, when will we get all these? and what really has to be done to eradicate it. Now, my personal feeling is it starts with all the parents, because a lot of the stuff is learned in the household and in the communities. Children, I remember in school, I went to a dominantly black school up through ninth grade. And I remember hearing from different kids, even in middle school and grade school, I would hear white kids say certain things and black kids say certain things. And I may not have realized this at the time, but in hindsight, I know that stuff is coming from the parents, from things they're overhearing, because there's no way they came up with that on their own. Not to get on a soapbox there, but parents have a huge responsibility in this thing. Nonetheless, his Vollmann's study of Martin Luther King, whom he calls one of his greatest heroes, of John Brown, of Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey. He digs into the history of the KKK and the different conflagrations between different racial groups. And man, there were just times when I was brought to tears, just choked up, and had to put the book down for a little bit, because it's just unbelievable what we have done, what humans have managed to do. But hopefully we can learn from these things and move on. But he does indeed take all of this and derive a moral calculus for when the defense of race and culture is and is not justified. Now, this is amazing and very, very important, and why I wish that this particular portion was chosen for publication. It's so difficult because nationalism and pride in one's culture is so entwined with hate and with greed that it's hard to separate them out anymore. But Vollmann does have an eye to this, and he does a great job getting in there into these extremely hot and tense issues, and giving us, the okay to be okay with our culture, because we should all celebrate our culture and who we are and our differences. But of course, once hate touches at that and taints it, it's just a poison. So he also wants to figure out how we stop that from happening. One of the things that stands out for Vollmann about Martin Luther King is he says he set himself a far higher standard than he needed to, especially when we pit King's actions or inactions against Vollmann's derivative moral calculus. And he says, and for that alone, he's one of my heroes. I could go on and on and on about this volume of Rising Up and Rising Down, but I'll leave it there, and we'll pick up next time with Volume 3, where we continue our case studies of justifications for defense of different categories throughout history.